Welcome back to these studies in the book written by one of Jesus' followers and entitled The Good News of Jesus Christ. Today we come to a long section of his book, but we can only make sense of what is taking place if we study it in one go. So in chapter 7 verses 1 to 23, Mark, the follower of Jesus to whom we refer, records the following story. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that's unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat until they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as a washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" Jesus replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honour me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." You've let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. And Jesus continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honour your father and mother,' and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is, devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." Again Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this: nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them." After he'd left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked them. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it's from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." This is indeed a long section in Mark's Gospel, and it's a very important one. It touches upon issues that lay at the very heart of Jesus' ministry and were clearly of enormous importance to him, and therefore they ought to be of importance to us if we are interested in him. Fundamentally, all that is recorded here concerns one question: what is the nature of the true worship of God? Jesus' own answer emerges from his discussion with the Pharisees, a Jewish sect who were committed to an extreme form of asceticism. In the first half of this passage, Jesus teaches that the true worship of God is seen in lives of radical obedience to all that God has revealed. Now, put this way, the Pharisees would not initially have disagreed. They too believed that God had spoken in the past and that his words were preserved in the Torah, what the Christians today call the Old Testament. However, Jesus' point is that over centuries a whole collection of interpretations of God's words had arisen, in which one misunderstanding of what God had meant had been followed by another, so that what God intended to say had been utterly lost. In fact, and this is Jesus' point in practical terms, this meant the Pharisees quoted the tradition rather than scriptures where God's words were found. Indeed, some of the leading religious leaders of the day even argued that these traditions were more authoritative than the scriptures. Even more seriously, in Jesus' view, this accumulation of human ideas unchecked by God's words had led to situations, was Jesus quoting a local cause célèbre, where the traditions had completely overthrown the clear demand or the teaching of God. This is the point of his illustration about the practice of Korban. All this leads Jesus to make his fundamental point. The Pharisees and those who followed and admired them had misunderstood the nature of true religion. The Pharisees had devised a religion centered around a host of religious rituals, and this is of course often true of religions throughout the world today. However, Jesus emphasizes that submission and obedience to God lay at the very heart of God's teachings in the holy books of the Jewish faith. The Pharisees had missed this completely and devised a humanly inspired religion in its place. So why does Mark include this story in his book? We know by now that his main purpose for writing was to convince his readers that Jesus Christ was God incarnate, the long-promised answer to the deepest of our spiritual needs. He's attempted to demonstrate by stories from Jesus' life that this extraordinary claim has lots of evidence to support it. The things Jesus did, the words that he spoke, the very person that he was, all, so Mark believes, bring us face to face with God with a human face. If this is the case, what Jesus says is very important indeed, more important than anyone else who has ever lived. So Jesus teaches us that a truly spiritual life is not achieved by humanly devised rules and extreme forms of asceticism. Central to a truly spiritual life is a willingness to listen to God rather than tell God what he should have said. Listening to God, Jesus says, begins with an openness to what God has said and a willingness to follow its teachings. And since Jesus is God, Jesus is implicitly claiming that the truly spiritual life involves our submission to him and to him alone. That's a huge challenge. But Mark is persuaded that if we are serious about spiritual matters, we will at least be ready to hear Mark, and of course Jesus, out. And to do so, they believe, will utterly transform who we are and will fulfill the deepest longings of every human heart.